Imagine living in a world where your very body did not belong to you, where every breath, every step, every dream was controlled by someone else. For millions of enslaved black men in America, this was not imagination, it was reality. They were not recognized as human beings with rights, hopes, or families. Instead, they were classified as property, bound in iron devices, and subjected to endless torment. Their stories were buried, their pain silenced, and their dignity stripped away by a system designed to erase their humanity. But history has a way of leaving clues. The collars, shackles, and chains still exist in museums and archives today, silent witnesses to a past that many would prefer to forget. These were not just tools of restraint, they were tools of control, meant to break the spirit and send a chilling message. Resistance was dangerous, and obedience was the only way to survive. Yet, even in this darkness, enslaved men found ways to hold on to courage, to protect fragments of identity, and to pass on resilience to generations yet to come. When we think of slavery, the narrative often focuses on forced labor in cotton fields or plantations. What is less discussed but equally vital to understand is the psychological warfare used against enslaved black men. The iron mask, the neck collars, the brutal punishments were not simply about preventing escape. They were a performance of dominance, designed to reinforce a cruel hierarchy where one race held complete control over another. In every sense, it was a system built to crush not only the body but also the mind. Why does this matter today? Because silence protects systems of oppression, while truth shatters them. By uncovering these hidden stories, we honor those who endured the unimaginable and ensure that their suffering was not in vain. We confront uncomfortable truths so that we can build a more honest and just future. The legacy of slavery is not just in history books. It lives on in the struggles and resilience of black communities today. To understand where we are, we must first acknowledge where we came from. This video will take you deep into the realities that textbooks often avoid. We will explore the brutal systems of control, the economic machinery that profited from human suffering, and the incredible resilience of people who refused to be erased. It is not just a history lesson, it is a call to remember, to reflect, and to recognize that telling the full truth is an act of justice in itself. If you believe these stories must be heard, if you believe history should not be hidden, then I invite you to support this journey. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about truth and justice. Together, we can shine a light on the chapters of history that were meant to stay in the shadows. Let us honor the lives that came before us by refusing to let them be forgotten. The iron collars, chains, and instruments of restraint were designed to crush the spirit of enslaved black men. Yet even when the physical suffering was overwhelming, another quieter and crueler reality was shaping the fate of generations. The simple act of survival. Life itself was fleeting in bondage. For those trapped in slavery, the struggle was not just about enduring brutal punishments or resisting psychological domination, it was about whether they, or their children, would live long enough to see another day. Records and testimonies reveal a devastating truth. The life expectancy of enslaved people was drastically shorter than that of their white counterparts. And the tragedy was most apparent in the lives of children. Nearly half of all enslaved infants did not survive their first year of life, their cries fading into silence before they had even begun to experience the world. This staggering loss was not an accident of nature, but the predictable outcome of a system that treated human beings as commodities rather than as families, mothers, or children. Enslaved women often had no choice but to continue working through their pregnancies, enduring exhausting labor under the hot sun or in suffocating quarters, with little rest, poor nutrition, and no medical care. Many gave birth in unsanitary conditions, often in the fields themselves, only to return to work almost immediately. Their newborns entered the world already disadvantaged. Their tiny bodies weakened by malnourishment and the relentless weight of a society that denied them even the most basic chance at life. For mothers, the grief was unbearable, but the system did not allow space for mourning. To enslavers, each child was measured not by their humanity, but by their potential market value, a cold calculation that stripped the birth of joy and replaced it with economic projection. The harsh living environments further worsened this cycle. Enslaved families were crowded into small cabins, often with dirt floors and little ventilation, making the spread of disease inevitable. Clean water was scarce, sanitation was almost non-existent, and the medical assistance that enslaved people received was limited. Experimental, or neglectful at best, infant illnesses that might have been preventable or treatable were left to run their course, and mothers were often powerless to intervene. Even breastfeeding, a natural bond between mother and child, was disrupted by the demands of slavery. Many enslaved women were forced to nurse the children of their enslavers while their own babies went hungry. These conditions, multiplied by thousands of lives across hundreds of plantations, created a quiet but devastating genocide that robbed communities of their youngest and most vulnerable members. The emotional toll of this reality cannot be overstated. Every loss rippled through enslaved families and communities, leaving scars that shaped their collective identity. For parents, the grief was compounded by a sense of powerlessness. Knowing they could not shield their children from the dangers that surrounded them. For siblings, the absence of brothers and sisters meant growing up in a constant state of instability, and for the surviving children, their earliest memories were often marked by death, loss, and the awareness that their lives could be cut short at any moment. This constant confrontation with mortality created a culture of resilience. But it also carried the weight of deep generational trauma, echoes of which continue to shape the present. Yet, even in the face of these staggering odds, enslaved families fought to preserve their humanity. Mothers whispered lullabies, fathers carved wooden toys, and communities shared what little resources they had to give infants a chance at survival. Spiritual traditions, songs, and stories became lifelines, a way of protecting children not just physically but emotionally, offering them hope in a world designed to deny them dignity. These acts of care, though small in the shadow of such overwhelming loss, were forms of resistance in themselves. They were declarations that even if the system sought to erase them, love and memory would endure. What is striking is how these hidden histories complicate the broader narrative of slavery. Too often, the story is told only in terms of labor and economics: the cotton, the sugar, the tobacco that enriched a nation. But behind every bale, every field, and every dollar was the silent cost of lost lives, particularly the lives of children who never had the chance to grow, dream, or contribute their voices to the future. The high infant mortality rate was not merely a tragic byproduct of slavery. It was evidence of how deeply dehumanization had penetrated every aspect of life. When a society accepts that nearly half of its enslaved infants may not survive and continues to function without outrage, it reveals the terrifying extent to which cruelty had been normalized. This truth also reshapes the way we think about resilience. The survival of black families and communities through such devastating loss was nothing short of extraordinary. Every child who did survive, every adult who managed to live beyond the years expected by enslavers, carried the weight of not only their own existence, but also the memory of countless others who did not. Their perseverance becomes an act of defiance, proof that even in the harshest conditions, humanity can persist, and it is this survival that allowed traditions, languages, and cultural practices to be passed down, ensuring that the heritage of enslaved people was not completely destroyed. As we revisit these stories today, We are not only uncovering statistics, but confronting the lived realities behind them. Each number represents a child, a mother, a father, a family. Each loss weakened the foundation of communities while strengthening the resolve to endure. To remember these truths is to honor those whose voices were silenced before they could even speak. It is to acknowledge that the wealth and power built during that era came at a cost so profound it can never be repaid. The legacy of these shortened lives is still with us. Health disparities. Systemic inequalities and generational trauma trace their roots back to these very conditions. By bringing these hidden truths into the light, we resist the erasure that has long been part of the narrative. We affirm that the children who were lost matter, that their stories must be told, and that their lives, though brief, hold meaning. And in telling these stories, we find a deeper understanding not only of history, but of the resilience, courage, and humanity that endured against all odds. The chains, the shortened lives of children, and the endless grief of families were only part of the cruelty that defined slavery. Beneath the surface of labor and punishment was another form of domination, one that struck at the core of identity and family bonds. Enslaved men and women were vulnerable to the desires and power of their enslavers, subjected to exploitation that left wounds far deeper than the body could show. This exploitation was not just about physical violation. It was about asserting ownership in the most intimate and devastating way possible, leaving families fractured and the very notion of masculinity and motherhood torn apart. The household, which should have been a place of refuge, became a stage where power was reinforced through control over the most personal aspects of life. Enslaved women, often seen by enslavers as property to be used at will, were denied the basic right to refuse. Their bodies were treated as extensions of economic and social dominance, forcing them into situations where consent did not exist. The children born of these encounters were reminders of the blurred lines between violence and ownership, and for enslaved families, each child could become a painful emblem of both survival and exploitation. Mothers carried not only the weight of nurturing, but also the burden of trauma, knowing that their children might be sold away or forced into the same system that had violated them. For enslaved, the assault on masculinity was equally devastating. The ideals of fatherhood, protection, and partnership were systematically dismantled. To be unable to protect wives or daughters from abuse inflicted a psychological torment that was as crushing as physical chains. In many cases, enslaved men themselves were exploited, stripped of the dignity that came with their identity, and reduced to instruments in the eyes of their oppressors. This deliberate undermining of masculinity was a tactic of control, ensuring that men could not fully embody roles of guardianship or leadership within their own families. Every act of violation was both personal and communal, sending ripples of pain through the broader enslaved community, reminding them that no boundary was sacred under slavery. The destruction of family bonds was perhaps the most far-reaching consequence. Families were not only separated through sale and trade, but also destabilized through the constant threat of exploitation. Trust within relationships was challenged by the reality that enslavers could intrude at any moment, reshaping the dynamics of marriage, parenthood, and kinship. The intimacy that should have been private and sacred was continually exposed to the whims of those who held power. This deliberate erosion of family life ensured that the enslaved remained vulnerable, their emotional lives entangled in a web of fear, shame, and grief. Yet within this pain, resistance took forms that were both subtle and profound. Enslaved women passed down stories, songs, and practices that preserved their dignity and humanity, even when their bodies were denied agency. Men found strength in communal bonds, creating brotherhoods that reinforced resilience and offered each other the support that the system tried to strip away. Families, even when fragmented, rebuilt themselves in the spaces left behind, proving that love and connection could survive even under relentless attack. These acts of endurance did not erase the suffering, but they asserted that the enslaved were more than victims. They were human beings who fought to retain identity, spirit, and community. The legacy of this hidden chapter is profound. It complicates the way we understand the trauma of slavery because it reveals how deeply it invaded the core of human relationships. The violence was not confined to fields, cabins, or markets. It entered homes, hearts, and futures. Generational scars were etched not just in the physical toll of labor, but in the ruptured sense of safety, intimacy, and family. This history reminds us that the harm of slavery cannot be measured only in terms of economic exploitation or physical suffering. It must also be understood through the personal violations that reshaped entire communities. When we uncover these truths today, we acknowledge not just the injustice but also the resilience that followed. The ability of enslaved people to continue creating families, to nurture children, to find love, and to hold on to their humanity in the midst of such exploitation is a testament to their strength. They carved out moments of joy in stolen hours, created bonds of kinship that outlived separation, and passed down traditions that carried the memory of survival. Each story we tell today is a refusal to allow that erasure to succeed, a declaration that even in the face of unimaginable domination, humanity endured. Understanding this part of history forces us to look at the legacy left behind. The destruction of family bonds under slavery reverberates across generations, influencing cultural memory, shaping community dynamics, and reminding us how power once sought to control even the most private spaces. By telling these stories, we resist the silence that history tried to impose, and we give voice to those who were denied it in their own time. Their experiences were not isolated tragedies, but part of a larger system that sought to redefine what it meant to be human. And in remembering them, we challenge the continuation of those narratives in any form. The story of sexual exploitation within slavery is not easy to confront, but it is essential. It deepens our understanding of what it meant to live under a system designed to strip away every layer of dignity and autonomy. It asks us to consider not only the physical scars, but also the emotional and spiritual ones. Scars that shaped families and communities long after the formal end of slavery. To bring these truths to light is to honor the resilience of those who carried them and to ensure that their pain is neither forgotten nor minimized. It is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, there were voices, lives, and stories that demand to be heard. The chains that bound the body, the shortened lives of children, and the violations that tore apart families were only fragments of a larger machinery designed to turn human beings into instruments of profit. Beyond the grueling labor in the fields and the constant threat of punishment, there was another system, quieter but no less brutal, that targeted the most intimate aspects of life. Enslaved men and women were not only denied freedom of movement or speech, they were denied freedom over their own futures, their relationships, and even the creation of their families. Within this system, reproduction itself was transformed into an economic strategy. Enslaved people were compelled to bear children not out of choice or love, but because every new birth meant another life bound by law to servitude, another body added to the ledger of wealth. This practice became especially important in the years when the transatlantic trade was restricted, and enslavers sought to secure their fortunes by creating new generations from those already in bondage. Men and women were matched, sometimes against their will, sometimes even with relatives, in arrangements that treated them not as individuals, but as breeding stock. The idea of family, already fragile under constant threat of separation, was further corrupted by the knowledge that relationships could be forced, manipulated, or broken depending on the economic interests of those in power. The most sacred act of bringing a child into the world was stripped of its dignity, replaced by calculation and profit. For enslaved mothers, the burden was staggering. Their bodies were expected to produce children who would never be free, children who could be sold or traded long before they learned to speak. Pregnancy was not a personal journey but a demand, often followed by an almost immediate return to hard labor. The joy of new life was overshadowed by the fear that this life would not remain within their arms. Many mothers saw their children taken from them, sent to other plantations, or raised under the control of people who saw them as investments rather than sons and daughters. The emotional weight of such losses, repeated generation after generation, became a quiet but enduring form of violence. For enslaved, the practice stripped away autonomy and dignity in equal measure. Being forced into relationships without consent, sometimes with partners they did not choose or even know, was a direct attack on their identity and humanity. Fatherhood, already made fragile by the constant threat of separation, was further undermined by the reality that their children, too, were bound to a system of exploitation. The knowledge that they could not protect their families or determine the circumstances of their children's birth was a wound carried deep within the soul, one that reshaped the meaning of masculinity and responsibility. Children born into this system grew up never knowing the possibility of freedom. From the moment of their first cry, their lives were mapped out by laws and practices that declared them property. Their earliest experiences were marked not by choice but by compulsion. Their futures predetermined by a society that valued them not for their potential as individuals, but for their capacity to serve the needs of others. The innocence of childhood was consumed by the weight of ownership, and even before they could understand the world, they were already bound to its harshest realities. The destruction of natural family bonds was not simply a byproduct of slavery. It was an intentional feature of it. By turning reproduction into profit, enslavers ensured that the system could perpetuate itself indefinitely. This meant that the cycle of suffering did not require new ships or distant trades. It could sustain itself through the very people it had already captured. The home, which should have been a sanctuary of love and safety, became a place where the future itself was predetermined by law and reinforced by force. Yet within this oppression, there was resistance. Families sought to reclaim what dignity they could, finding ways to form bonds of love and care even under coercion. Parents instilled values, stories, and traditions in their children, teaching them that their worth was greater than the system allowed. Communities built networks of kinship that extended beyond bloodlines, ensuring that children grew up surrounded by a sense of belonging even when their biological families were torn apart. These acts of defiance were quiet but powerful, a way of declaring that humanity could not be fully erased, even when every law and practice sought to deny it. The long-term consequences of this system cannot be overstated. It left scars that traveled across generations, shaping not only the immediate lives of those in bondage, but also the cultural memory of their descendants. The pain of coerced relationships, the grief of children lost, and the knowledge that even the most intimate aspects of life had been controlled by others became part of a collective inheritance. This history reminds us that the damage of slavery extended far beyond physical labor and economic exploitation. It reached into the deepest parts of human identity, reshaping family, love, and future in ways that echo still. To confront this truth is to acknowledge that slavery was not only about fields, whips, and chains, but also about the deliberate corruption of the most sacred human bonds. It is to understand that the legacy of those forced to reproduce for profit is not one of silence, but of resilience. For despite the weight of coercion, families found ways to endure, to nurture, and to pass on the strength that would one day fuel movements for freedom and justice. Their survival in the face of such calculated cruelty is a testament not only to the horror of the system, but to the unbreakable spirit of those who lived within it. The story of enslavement was not only written in the lives of those who endured chains, forced labor, and broken families. It was also written in ledgers, contracts, and the vaults of banks. Human lives became the currency upon which an entire nation built its wealth. By the middle of the 19th century, those in bondage were not merely seen as laborers in the fields, but as the most valuable economic assets in the United States. They were appraised, listed, and calculated with the precision reserved for property. Yet their presence carried a weight far beyond mere numbers. Plantations thrived because of them, industries relied on them, and the financial system itself found ways to turn their bodies and lives into instruments of capital growth. As cotton production expanded and America pushed westward, the demand for labor increased at an overwhelming pace. With the international trade of enslaved people cut off, the system adapted by looking inward, calculating that every child born into bondage represented not just another life, but another line of credit, another measure of security for loans, another piece of collateral that could be leveraged in a banking office. In towns across the South, enslaved men, women, and children were recorded in account books and pledged against debts, their very existence transformed into financial instruments. Banks issued loans to plantation owners who mortgaged their enslaved workers as collateral, and these loans were then bundled and sold to investors in cities like New York, London, Paris, and Amsterdam. The cycle created wealth not only for the slaveholding South, but for the financial capitals of the world, tying the lives of the oppressed to the fortunes of global markets. It was not unusual for a wealthy landowner to walk into a bank, list the names and ages of the enslaved people on his plantation, and walk out with the funds to expand his enterprise. These transactions turned human beings into securities, and in the process, their value soared. By 1860, the total worth of enslaved people in the United States was estimated to be greater than all the factories, railroads, and banks combined. They were worth more than all the gold and silver in the country, more than the farmland of the South, more than any other single asset. The foundation of America's wealth, the backbone of its economic rise, rested squarely on the backs of those who had no freedom. This transformation of people into collateral reveals the depth of the system's reach. It was not only the plantation fields that depended on slavery, but the very architecture of American capitalism. Insurance companies wrote policies on enslaved lives, ensuring that slaveholders would be compensated for losses due to death or escape. Investment firms marketed bonds backed by enslaved people, enticing buyers with promises of steady returns. Even in regions where slavery was outlawed, investors bought into these securities, profiting indirectly from the system they publicly denounced. It was a web that extended across oceans, linking the cotton picked in southern fields to the mills of Manchester, the banks of London, and the markets of Europe. For those in bondage, this financial entanglement added another cruel layer to their suffering. They were not only trapped in physical labor, but bound within a system that saw them as numbers on a balance sheet. Every movement of the economy, every shift in markets, every loan or investment was made possible through their exploitation. To be sold or transferred was not always a decision made by the overseer on the plantation, but sometimes the result of a distant investor demanding repayment, a bank foreclosing on a loan, or a creditor calling in debt. Families could be torn apart not because of disobedience or rebellion, but because financial pressures dictated their sale. The reach of slavery into finance also meant that its end would never be simple. When emancipation finally came, the loss to slaveholders was calculated not in human terms but in economic ones. The abolition of slavery stripped the South of its most valuable assets overnight, leading to economic upheaval, bitterness, and resistance that fueled new systems of oppression designed to preserve the old hierarchies. But the wealth already extracted through generations of bondage had already laid the foundation for the nation's rise. Railroads were built with profits from slavery. Universities were funded by the fortunes of slave traders. Banks expanded on the strength of their investments in human collateral. The wealth remained, even when the system itself was dismantled. The irony of this history is that those who were considered property were, in truth, the very builders of America's prosperity. Without their labor, there would have been no cotton empire, no industrial revolution fueled by southern exports, no banking system enriched by securitized human lives. They were the hidden capital, the silent investors whose returns were stolen and whose dividends funded the growth of a nation. Their suffering was converted into wealth, their endurance into progress, their bondage into profit. And yet, despite being treated as numbers, their humanity endured. The enslaved found ways to resist dehumanization, to hold on to their identities, their cultures, and their hopes. While their names appeared in bank ledgers, they also lived in songs, prayers, and whispered stories passed down through generations. They may have been reduced to collateral in the eyes of financiers, but they remained fathers, mothers, children, and friends in the eyes of one another. Their legacy is not one of silence but of resilience, a reminder that beneath the weight of financial exploitation lived real people whose spirits could not be fully erased. The story of enslaved people as America's most valuable asset forces us to see slavery not only as a system of labor but as the very foundation of modern finance. It shows how deeply exploitation was woven into the rise of the United States, and how the echoes of that system still linger in structures of inequality today. It is a reminder that the wealth of a nation was built on the lives of those who were denied even the most basic freedoms, and that acknowledging this truth is essential if we are to fully understand both the history and the present. The system of bondage was not only built on forced labor, exploitation, and the destruction of family bonds, but also on calculated acts of humiliation meant to strip away dignity and instill fear so deep it could pass from one generation to the next. Enslaved men, in particular, were subjected to punishments designed not merely to control their bodies, but to fracture their very sense of identity. These punishments were brutal not only in their physical execution, but also in the way they attacked manhood, reducing strong, resilient individuals into spectacles of suffering that reinforced the dominance of those in power. When threats of whips or chains failed to intimidate, enslavers turned to methods that left marks not only on flesh but on the spirit. Castration was one such punishment, a horrifying act that carried both physical agony and psychological devastation. To take from a man his ability to father children was to deny him the natural roles of protector and provider, cutting at the core of how he might define his place in the world. This was not punishment for crime but punishment for perceived threats. Whether a glance exchanged with a woman from the master's household, or an act of defiance too bold for the oppressor to ignore. By wielding such punishments, enslavers proclaimed that masculinity itself could be controlled, reshaped, or destroyed at their will. Forced nudity was another method, a deliberate stripping away of not just clothing but of privacy, dignity, and humanity. To be paraded unclothed before others, sometimes before one's own family or community, was to be reduced to a spectacle, an object to be mocked or ridiculed. These acts were not carried out in secret. They were staged, orchestrated to send a message to all who witnessed them. They proclaimed that no enslaved person, no matter how strong or respected among their peers, could claim authority over their own body. Even the most personal boundaries could be invaded and used as tools of domination. Physical mutilation took many forms, each one reinforcing the power imbalance at the heart of the system. Fingers might be cut away to prevent a man from working skillfully. Ears branded or cropped to mark him as property. Scars carved into skin that already bore the marks of whips. Each mutilation served a dual purpose: to punish the individual and to warn the community. The pain inflicted on one body became a lesson for all others, a reminder of the consequences of resistance. Yet even as these punishments sought to inspire terror, they also revealed the deep fear enslavers carried, the fear that the people they oppressed might one day rise, resist, and reclaim the strength that had been denied to them. The cruelty of these punishments was not random but systematic. Enslavers understood that to maintain control, they had to break more than bodies, they had to fracture the bonds of solidarity, weaken the confidence of leaders, and dismantle the sense of pride that could fuel resistance. By targeting men in such intimate and degrading ways, they attacked the idea of manhood itself, hoping to leave behind men who doubted their worth, who questioned their own strength, and who felt powerless to protect their families. This was psychological warfare as much as physical punishment, a campaign designed to keep rebellion at bay by turning potential leaders into examples of brokenness. For the families and communities who witnessed these acts, the trauma was collective. Wives and children who saw their husbands or fathers humiliated carried the scars as well, forced to watch the destruction of someone they loved. Young boys grew up with the memory of seeing their elders stripped and punished, a memory meant to shape their own behavior, to teach them obedience through fear. Women, too, bore the weight, knowing that the men who might otherwise stand beside them as protectors were made vulnerable before their eyes. The entire system relied on this shared fear, a fear cultivated through rituals of cruelty that reminded everyone of the imbalance of power. And yet, even under these circumstances, resilience persisted. Though their bodies were marked, many enslaved men refused to let their spirits be broken. They continued to carry themselves with pride, to pass on stories of strength and endurance, to find ways of resisting even within the confines of punishment. Families learned to support one another, creating bonds that oppression could not fully destroy. Communities developed quiet forms of defiance, from spiritual songs that carried hidden meanings to acts of solidarity that reminded them of their shared humanity. Each act of cruelty was met, in time, with acts of endurance that proved domination could never be complete. Looking back, it is clear that these punishments were not only about individual discipline, but about maintaining an entire social order. By demonstrating control over the bodies of enslaved men, enslavers affirmed their own position of authority, reminding both black and white communities that the hierarchy was to remain unquestioned. These acts of violence were public theater, rituals that reaffirmed white dominance not only in the eyes of the oppressed but also in the eyes of those who benefited from the system. It was a performance of power, staged again and again to keep the structure intact. But history also records the cracks in that structure. For every man who bore scars of mutilation, there were others who ran, who resisted, who fought back despite the risks. For every community silenced by fear, there were whispers of rebellion, hidden meetings, and quiet acts of sabotage. The punishments meant to suppress resistance often fueled it instead, planting seeds of anger and determination that would one day contribute to the larger movements for freedom and justice. The legacy of these acts is not only one of cruelty but also one of survival, a reminder that even the harshest attempts to erase dignity cannot succeed against the will to endure. In telling these stories, we are reminded that the system of bondage sought to control every part of life, from birth to labor to the body itself. Punishments like castration, forced nudity, and mutilation reveal not only the cruelty of the era, but the desperation of those who relied on such measures to maintain control. They feared the strength of the very people they sought to dominate, and so they struck at the core of identity, hoping to fracture what could never truly be broken. The memory of that resilience, carried forward by generations, remains one of the most powerful testaments to the human spirit in the face of unimaginable oppression. Among the darkest tactics used to maintain control over enslaved communities was the calculated humiliation of men through acts meant to break both body and spirit. And one of the most devastating of these was sexual assault carried out in public spaces, where the purpose was not only to violate the individual, but to send a message to all who watched. In such moments, power was displayed in its rawest form, reducing a man who might have been a leader, a father, or a symbol of quiet resistance into an object of suffering, stripping him of dignity in a way designed to instill terror throughout the entire community. These acts were not carried out in secrecy but staged deliberately, for their power came not just from the act itself but from the spectacle, from the knowledge that no man was safe from degradation if those in power chose to inflict it. This form of control cut deeper than physical chains, for it attacked the core of identity and selfhood, dismantling the sense of masculinity that enslaved men carried with them despite the hardships of forced labor and systemic oppression. To see one of their own subjected to such violence was to witness the stripping away of pride, authority, and respect, the very qualities that could inspire resistance or unity among the enslaved. For the man himself, the scars left behind went far beyond the body, embedding themselves in memory and reshaping his sense of self in ways that words cannot fully capture. The act was meant to linger, not only for him but for every person forced to watch. A reminder that even the most personal boundaries could be violated at will by those who claimed ownership over their lives. The psychological impact of these assaults was profound and enduring. Men who endured such treatment often carried with them a deep sense of shame, not because they were at fault, but because the society around them had been conditioned to see such humiliation as proof of powerlessness. That shame was compounded by the fact that these acts were carried out publicly, in front of peers, family members, and sometimes even children, ensuring that the memory of the event would spread beyond the individual and become part of the collective trauma of the community. It was not simply about destroying one man's spirit, but about poisoning the well of hope from which others might draw strength. Families who witnessed such violence suffered alongside the victim, internalizing fear and helplessness that seeped into daily life. What made this cruelty particularly devastating was the way it attacked the very foundations of resistance. Enslaved men were often seen as potential protectors and leaders, figures who could rally others or defend their families in moments of crisis. By targeting them with such violations, enslavers sought to dismantle the idea that men could stand as shields for their loved ones. If a man could be publicly humiliated and stripped of his dignity in front of those he cared for, what hope was left for rebellion? The message was clear. Power belonged entirely to the oppressors, and any challenge to that power would be met with punishments so dehumanizing that they reached into the deepest parts of the soul. And yet, even within this calculated cruelty, there remained a thread of resistance, quiet but unyielding. The very fact that such acts were necessary reveals the fear enslavers carried in their hearts. The recognition that strength still lived within the people they sought to dominate. The assaults were not only displays of power, but also acknowledgments of vulnerability, attempts to crush the seeds of rebellion that they knew could take root if left unchecked. Every public violation was an admission that the enslaved were not broken by labor alone, that their spirits had to be targeted because physical chains could never fully contain them. Communities responded in ways both visible and invisible. While fear and silence often prevailed in the immediate aftermath, there were also acts of quiet defiance, gestures of solidarity that helped survivors carry on. Stories of resilience circulated in whispers, songs carried hidden meanings of endurance, and faith traditions provided frameworks for understanding suffering not as shame but as a burden unjustly imposed by others. Families learned to comfort and support one another, building bonds that gave them the strength to endure even the most humiliating acts. Though the scars were deep, they also became reminders of survival, proof that even the most violent attempts to erase humanity could not completely succeed. For the broader system of oppression, these public assaults served as a grim kind of theater, reinforcing hierarchies not only for the enslaved but also for white audiences who were taught to see dominance as natural and unquestionable. By enacting violence in such visible ways, enslavers reinforced the social order for all who lived within it, ensuring that the cruelty became part of the cultural fabric. It was a ritual of control, repeated again and again, each performance reaffirming the lie that one group of people had the right to dominate another. Looking back today, it is impossible to ignore the depth of suffering caused by such acts. But it is equally impossible to ignore the resilience of those who endured them. The psychological scars were real, passed down through generations in ways that shaped communities long after bondage officially ended. Yet the memory of survival is just as real, a testament to strength that refused to be extinguished. By remembering these stories, by speaking them aloud instead of allowing them to remain hidden, we honor not only the pain, but also the perseverance of those who lived through it. The story of these public humiliations is not just a chapter in the history of bondage. It is a window into the mechanics of power and the ways fear is used to control societies. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how far systems of oppression will go to preserve themselves. And it challenges us to recognize the ongoing echoes of that trauma in the present. To tell this story is to resist the erasure that those in power once tried to enforce, and to affirm that dignity, though assaulted and scarred, was never truly destroyed. When the system of slavery was finally dismantled, one might imagine that freedom would bring with it dignity, safety, and the long-denied chance to rebuild lives torn apart by centuries of oppression. Yet the end of legal bondage did not mean the end of violence or the dismantling of the lies that had been carefully crafted to sustain white dominance. Instead, those lies transformed, taking on new shapes that would haunt generations to come. Among the most destructive was the myth of the so-called black rapist, a false narrative designed to paint black men as predators and threats to white womanhood. This myth was not born out of truth but out of fear, resentment, and the desperate need to maintain control in a world where the legal right to own human beings had been stripped away. The power of this myth lay not in evidence, for none existed, but in its ability to stir panic and justify unspeakable acts of violence. Newspapers carried sensationalized stories, communities whispered exaggerated rumors, and politicians capitalized on racial fear to reinforce systems of segregation. The accusation of assault, whether true or entirely fabricated, was often enough to seal the fate of a black man. In the years following emancipation, thousands were lynched across the South, their deaths framed as acts of protection for white women, when in reality they were instruments of terror meant to remind black communities that freedom was fragile, conditional, and forever under threat. Public lynchings became spectacles, drawing crowds who treated them not as crimes but as community rituals. Women, and even children, gathered to witness the killing of black men accused under this toxic myth, their bodies mutilated and displayed as warnings. Photographs were taken, sometimes turned into postcards, spreading the terror far beyond the scene itself. These were not just acts of brutality against individuals, but performances of dominance that echoed the earlier practices of slavery, updated for a society that no longer had the legal cover of bondage. The violence reinforced the idea that black life was expendable, that freedom could exist only within the narrow confines allowed by those who still clung to power. The myth of the black rapist also served a political purpose. By portraying black men as dangerous, lawmakers could justify the passage of Jim Crow laws that restricted movement, stripped voting rights, and reinforced segregation in every corner of public life. These laws were framed as protections, but in truth they were cages, designed to keep black communities economically disadvantaged and socially marginalized. The false narrative of predation gave white society the excuse it needed to uphold a racial order that had been threatened by emancipation. Instead of chains, there were curfews and vagrancy laws. Instead of overseers, there were sheriffs and mobs. Instead of slave codes, there was Jim Crow. For black families, the terror was unrelenting. Fathers and sons lived with the knowledge that a single accusation, no matter how baseless, could lead to death. Mothers and daughters endured the constant fear of losing loved ones to violence sanctioned by silence and indifference. The memory of slavery was still fresh, yet a new kind of bondage had taken its place, one rooted not in ownership but in intimidation and exclusion. The trauma of public assaults during slavery carried forward into the trauma of public lynchings, both designed to strip black men of their sense of safety, dignity, and authority within their own communities. The same weapon of humiliation was repurposed, proving that the abolition of slavery had not ended the struggle for humanity, but had merely shifted its battlefield. The myth also obscured a cruel irony. During slavery, it had been black women who endured widespread violation at the hands of white men. Yet after emancipation, it was black men who were falsely accused of posing the threat. The distortion was deliberate, flipping the narrative to protect white perpetrators and demonize black victims. In this way, the falsehood became a shield for those who had committed generations of abuse, while simultaneously fueling violence against those who had already borne centuries of suffering. The lie served as both erasure and weapon, ensuring that the true history of exploitation remained hidden while a new justification for racism took root. And yet, as in the era of slavery, resilience endured. Communities found ways to resist the dehumanization, through churches that became sanctuaries of strength, through education that nurtured hope, and through movements that demanded recognition of black humanity. Every lynching, every act of violence carried out under the shadow of this myth was a wound, but it was also a rallying cry for justice. Activists, writers, and leaders raised their voices to expose the lie, documenting the brutality and demanding that the world see the truth. Their efforts planted seeds that would grow into the great civil rights struggles of the 20th century, proving once again that even the most deeply entrenched systems of oppression could be challenged. The persistence of the black rapist myth reminds us that oppression does not always vanish when laws change. It adapts, shifting its form to survive in new eras. What began as chains and whips became rumors and mobs, then statutes and segregation. The strategy was always the same: instill fear, justify inequality, and maintain control. The consequences of this lie did not end with Jim Crow but echoed into the present, shaping narratives about crime, safety, and race that continue to influence society today. To understand the story fully, we must see how it connects to what came before. The sexual violence inflicted upon enslaved men to instill fear, the humiliations that sought to break spirits, and the public punishments that reinforced white dominance. All of these practices laid the foundation for the myths and systems that followed. The tools of control changed, but the intent remained the same. The narrative of danger projected onto black men after emancipation was simply another chapter in a long history of using fear to justify inequality. By remembering these truths, we refuse to allow the lies of the past to remain unchallenged. We honor the lives lost not only in bondage, but also in the shadow of lynching trees and under the cruel weight of segregation. We confront the myths for what they were: deliberate fabrications designed to protect power and deny humanity. And in doing so, we affirm that the legacy of those who suffered is not silence but survival, not erasure but endurance. A reminder that even in the face of lies, truth has the power to endure and to liberate. In the aftermath of emancipation, when the old order of slavery had been legally dismantled, but its shadow still lingered in every corner of American life, New organizations rose to ensure that the racial hierarchy would not collapse. Chief among them was the Ku Klux Klan, a group that cloaked itself in secrecy, ritual, and violence, presenting itself as the guardian of a world where white supremacy was the unquestioned foundation. The Klan was not just a gathering of masked men. It was a movement that used terror, propaganda, and calculated displays of dominance to remind black communities that freedom did not mean safety, and that equality would be resisted at every turn. Their power was amplified by networks of women's groups, which may not have wielded whips or torches, but played their own role in shaping the culture that allowed such terror to thrive. The Klan understood that fear was more powerful than law, that a single night raid or cross-burning could send waves of silence through an entire town. Dressed in white robes and hoods, they projected an image of faceless authority, as though they were not men at all but specters of an unyielding racial order. Under the cover of night, they stormed homes, dragged men from their beds, and left behind the echoes of violence that haunted survivors for years. These acts were not random but orchestrated, designed to crush the will of communities who dared to exercise the rights newly granted to them. To vote, to own land, to seek education, each of these acts of progress became reasons for intimidation, each a threat to the fragile illusion of white control. But the influence of the Klan was not confined to physical violence alone. They were adept at propaganda, weaving stories of danger and corruption that painted black progress as a menace to society. Pamphlets, speeches, and rumors spread like wildfire, framing the Klan not as villains but as protectors of tradition, morality, and family. Their message seeped into newspapers and pulpits, reinforcing the belief that the presence of black men in politics or business was unnatural, that the rise of black communities represented chaos rather than justice. By shaping public opinion, they ensured that their acts of violence would be met not with outrage but with silence, sometimes even with applause. The role of women in this system is often less visible but no less critical. Affiliated women's groups did not ride with the night riders, but they upheld the same ideology in ways that were quieter yet deeply influential. They organized social events, circulated petitions, and reinforced the idea that maintaining racial purity was a duty not only of men but of women as well. They taught their children the values of segregation, instilled fear of racial mixing, and celebrated the men who carried out violent acts as defenders of family honor. By weaving white supremacy into the fabric of everyday life, these women ensured that the ideology was not confined to mobs in the night but lived in schools, churches, and homes. Together, these forces created a society where black communities were never free from the threat of violence. Whether that violence came in the form of a mob with torches or a school policy that denied them access to opportunity. The Klan's influence extended into politics, where intimidation at polling places kept many from voting, and into the economy, where boycotts and threats targeted businesses that dared to serve black customers. The message was clear: progress would be punished, and silence was the price of survival. For black families, the fear was constant, woven into the rhythm of daily life. A man who worked too hard, who gained too much respect, or who simply exercised his rights could become a target overnight. Women who sought education or who challenged social norms faced the threat of harassment. Children grew up under the shadow of terror, learning too soon that their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. And yet, within this climate of fear, communities continued to resist, building churches that became sanctuaries, creating schools where knowledge was passed on despite threats, and nurturing networks of solidarity that allowed them to endure. The Klan's power lay not only in the acts they committed but in the culture they sustained. Their night rides were the continuation of the public punishments of slavery, updated for a new era where formal ownership had been outlawed but domination was still desired. Just as enslaved men had once been humiliated to break spirits, so now black voters were terrorized to silence their voices. The logic was the same. To maintain control, fear had to penetrate every household, every decision, every dream. And while the men in white robes projected the image of strength, their very existence revealed a deep insecurity. They feared the potential of a society where black men and women could rise without restraint, where the myths of inferiority could be challenged by undeniable evidence of resilience, intelligence, and achievement. Their violence was both a performance of power and an admission of weakness, a desperate attempt to cling to a world that was already beginning to change. The legacy of the Klan and its affiliated groups is a reminder that oppression is sustained not only by chains and whips but also by culture, by stories, and by the silent complicity of those who benefit from inequality. The hoods and robes may have represented secrecy, but the ideology they carried was woven into the open life of the nation, taught in schools, preached in sermons, and passed down at dinner tables. To confront this history is to acknowledge that white supremacy was not the work of a few extremists, but a system reinforced at every level of society. And yet, the story is not only one of terror but also of survival. Black communities, though targeted by violence and propaganda, refused to be erased. They organized, resisted, and built foundations for the civil rights movements that would one day rise to challenge the system. Every act of defiance, every vote cast despite threats, every child educated in secret was a blow against the order that the Klan sought to preserve. Their endurance became the counter-narrative, the proof that fear could not extinguish the will to be free. In remembering the role of the Ku Klux Klan and the women who upheld its ideology, we see not only the cruelty of the past, but also the resilience of those who lived through it. We recognize the ways terror and propaganda can shape societies, but we also see how communities can resist, adapt, and endure. The struggle did not end with the abolition of slavery, nor with the collapse of Jim Crow, for the echoes of this history remain with us still. But by telling these stories, by refusing to let silence protect the lies of the past, we carry forward the resilience that once defied the hoods and torches, ensuring that the truth endures where fear once reigned. The story we have traced is not only a history of brutality, exploitation, and systemic oppression, but also a story of silence imposed by those in power and silence that still lingers in classrooms, textbooks, and official records. Generational trauma does not fade with the passing of laws or the signing of amendments. It lingers in memory, in family stories, in the unspoken fears passed down from parents to children. It lingers in the deep wounds carved into institutions that were built on inequality and have too often worked to maintain it. What was done to enslaved people, and later reinforced by segregation and systemic racism, cannot simply be brushed away as the past. It lives on in disparities of health, wealth, and opportunity, and in the countless moments where history has been rewritten or suppressed to protect a narrative of national pride. When we speak of generational trauma, we are speaking of the child who grows up hearing fragments of stories too painful to tell in full, the family that still carries the weight of displacement or violence, and the community that finds its achievements overshadowed by the constant reminder of oppression. The United States, in so many ways, has struggled with telling the truth about this history. Textbooks often reduce slavery to a footnote, Jim Crow to a brief mention, and the struggle for civil rights to a few heroic names, leaving out the countless men and women who lived and died under the shadow of racism. Institutions have sanitized the narrative, portraying slavery as an economic necessity, segregation as a cultural issue, and racism as the work of extremists rather than a deeply rooted system. By doing, they erase the full humanity of those who suffered and the full responsibility of those who benefited. But hidden history does not stay hidden forever. It surfaces in the stories that families pass down, in the oral traditions that defy erasure, in the archives uncovered by determined historians, and in the voices of artists, writers, and educators who refuse to let silence have the final word. To uncover this history is to reclaim dignity, to give voice to those who were silenced, and to acknowledge that the struggles of the past are not separate from the challenges of the present. The trauma of slavery and segregation is reflected in today's struggles with mass incarceration, economic inequality, and racial violence. Each of these issues can be traced back to systems deliberately designed to disadvantage Black communities, and each is sustained by the refusal to confront history honestly. This is why telling these stories matters. It is not about dwelling on pain, but about illuminating truth. When history is hidden, we are left with myths of progress without struggle, myths of equality that never existed, myths that the wounds of the past no longer matter. Breaking those myths is the first step toward justice. The truth is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. It gives us the chance to see clearly, to understand the structures we have inherited, and to imagine something better. And so, as we close this journey through hidden Black history, let us remember that what was endured was not in vain. The resilience of enslaved people, the determination of those who lived under Jim Crow, the bravery of those who resisted the Klan, and the ongoing fight against systemic racism, all of these are testaments to strength and hope. These stories remind us that survival itself was an act of resistance, that to love, to learn, to build families and communities under oppression was to defy a system designed to break them. To those listening, thank you for walking through this history with us. Your willingness to engage with difficult truths is part of the work of healing. By remembering, by speaking, by refusing to let silence prevail, we honor those who came before us and carry forward their legacy of endurance and resistance. If this story has moved you, if it has opened your eyes to parts of history often left untold, we invite you to support this work by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who need to hear it. Every voice, every act of remembrance, helps to push back against the forces that still seek to erase these truths. As we move forward, let us not forget that hidden history becomes visible when we choose to look, when we choose to listen, and when we choose to tell it again and again. The trauma of the past is real, but so is the resilience that has carried generations through unimaginable suffering. That resilience is part of the story too, a story not just of pain but of power, creativity, and unbreakable spirit. So tonight, as you reflect on what you have heard, carry with you not only the weight of what was lost, but also the strength of what endured. Carry with you the reminder that history belongs not only to those who wrote it, but also to those who lived it, resisted it, and survived it. Carry with you the responsibility to ensure that silence does not erase truth again. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen. If you have not already, please like, subscribe, and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden histories that shape our world. Together, we can shine a light on what has too long been kept in the dark. And with that, I wish you peace. May your night be restful. May your spirit be steady. And may your dreams carry the hope of a future where truth is told, justice is pursued, and dignity is never denied. Good night, everyone.